This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode with Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken as they chat about mourning doves in Kansas, noting how their population has trended and hunting potential. Tina Sullivan and Molly Reichenborn keep the show rolling as they discuss renovating smooth brome grass. They explain what issues growers could run into and their recommendations. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show saying how the combination of temperature and humidity can have a huge impact on cows milking more than 77 pounds of milk per day. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode where we hear from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
I assume there are a lot of mourning dove. I see mourning dove all the time, just driving around. They seem to be fairly widespread, but what do the populations look like?
The estimates are that there's about 300 million of them actually, and that was back in 2024. That's the most up-to-date estimate that we have. But there's a whole bunch of these birds, and actually the central management unit. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service breaks these kinds of critters up into different management units. There's the Eastern Management Unit, the Central Management Unit, and the Western Management Unit. And the Central Management Unit, where we are, encompasses most of the Great Plains, and that's the largest population of mourning doves that there are in North America. So we produce the vast majority of these birds, and they call the Great Plains home.
Do you know anything about their breeding status or nesting status?
Yeah, so they're actually pretty rigid in terms of how many eggs per clutch they produce. It's basically always 2 eggs. So that seems like maybe they don't have very high fecundity, but they can produce multiple nests a year, depending on where you are. They might attempt 4 to 5 nests. Part of the reason that they can do that, it's sort of twofold. One of the reasons is those 2 eggs only take about 14 days or 2 weeks to hatch, and then it's another 2 weeks before those birds fledge. So basically a pair of doves can pull off a clutch, and if that clutch is successful, they'll be out of the nest in about a month, and then they can go ahead and start another nest. The other reason that they can have high fecundity, even with only producing 2 eggs per clutch, is that they're pretty flexible with a fairly long breeding season. So in Kansas, where we are, they're known to nest anywhere from February through September. If they pulled off their first clutch, or if they laid their first clutch in March, then we could have potentially had a clutch in March, April, May, June, July, August, and then September. So, that's basically a 7-month nesting season that they had there available to them.
Where are they making these nests most of the time? Are they making them on the ground or in trees? Where do they like to go?
It's interesting. It basically depends on what sort of cover they have available to them. If there are trees available, then they're going to nest in trees for the most part. But out in the prairie, here in the tallgrass prairie and the Flint Hills, it's not uncommon to find dove nests down in the grass. So they can either be a ground nesting bird or a tree nesting bird. But like I said, when trees are available, they tend to select those trees.
Are the trends for the populations, are they holding relatively steady over the last decade or two? Or have they dropped off? What's going on with dove?
Well, so we've got a couple of different ways of looking at this. If we look at it really long term, from the late 60s, when the data that we have for monitoring doves start, then we basically see generally speaking, some declines in dove populations, but they've actually rebounded in the last 10 years or so. And really it's in the last 5. When we look at the different regions that there are in the United States, the Eastern Management Unit has had a slight increase since 1966. And by slight, we're talking about just shy of 0.2% per year increase since 1996. But during that last 10 years or so, there's been just about a 0.75% decrease in the per year rate that we're looking at. Long term in the central management unit, there's been about a 34% decline per year since 1966. And we've had a continued short-term decline during the last 10 years in the central management unit. But really, during the last 5 years, they've rebounded to be almost as abundant as they were back in the 60s. So they've done really well. And then in the Western management unit, so the Western U.S., that's where they've had the strongest long-term decline at almost 0.90% per year. But during the last 10 years or so, they've been relatively stable. So if we think about what does this mean more recently, there were about 360 million birds in the U.S. in 2007. The low was about 280 million birds in 2021. But then, like I said, they got up to 337 million in 2024. So there can be some pretty strong annual fluctuations in dove abundance relative to their longer term trends. And right now it's looking pretty good.
Do you have any idea how many are harvested each year?
I don't have data for us for a per year basis, but
Sure.
that most recent year that this was looked at, 2024, just shy of 15 million doves. So 14.6 million mourning doves were harvested by almost a million hunters, 950,000.
Wow.
And this is actually a fairly big decline since the mid 2000s, and that's really related to the number of folks that are going out and the number of days that those folks are hunting. So we even though we've seen a decline, we're still seeing close to 15 million doves harvested every year by about a million hunters.
What are the numbers in our area in Kansas? You know what they look like?
A little over 600,000, approximately 630,000 birds annually harvested in Kansas, and that represents about 7% of the total harvest for that central management unit. So, Texas gets a big chunk of them, and then we harvest some here in Kansas, and that's sort of what that looks like.
If I want to encourage some of these mourning dove to be on my property, it doesn't even have to just be for hunting, but if I want to encourage more dove on my property, what are some things that I could do as a habitat manager to help that happen?
They're a species that really likes seeds. And so most birds that eat a lot of seeds tend to be fairly strongly correlated with weeds in our part of the country. And so, those weedy field borders that used to be pretty common, or even weeds in fallow farm fields or crop fields and those sorts of things, can be important to these birds. There's also important cover that might be associated with that too. So encouraging that sort of thing. And we're not telling folks, when we're thinking about managing for wildlife, we're not saying that you shouldn't do the things that you need to do as an agricultural producer in order to farm the way that you need to. But, sometimes having some what we used to call odd areas when we're thinking about wildlife management, it could be an old homestead that's not used very much for anything else that turns into a weedy area. Lots and lots of species like ragweed. When we think about seeds, the kind of plants that we see in a lot of areas where we end up having doves during the hunting season, a lot of times that's going to be seeds that or plants that produce a little bit bigger seeds. Snow on the mountain is one of those that we think about doves being associated with. Buffalo burr, of course, that's not one that a lot of people like to have around, but that's a really good dove food plant. Lots of different sunflowers that might be around. Annual sunflower is, of course, the one that folks think of the most, but there's a lot of different native sunflowers that will grow in odd areas because it's an early successional plant, but we also might see it out in rangelands. Out in the rangelands, it'd be more likely to see something like Maximilian sunflower or stiff sunflower, and some of those, even compass plant, if we're not grazing really heavily and we got some areas that the cattle leave alone. So lots of different plants like that, but it tends to be those early successional weedy type plants that provide a lot of food. And then, if we had nesting doves that were taking food back to the fledglings in the nest, or the chicks in the nest, then of course they're bringing insects back. And weeds and insects really go hand in hand. And so that there's multiple purposes for those weedy areas that the doves are getting. And another thing, if we're thinking about huntability of an area for mourning doves, then the ponds, like you're so excited about, Joe, that's an important thing for doves because they do need water, and they will come to those ponds. And really, the ponds that I like to hunt around are going to be ponds that sort of combine the availability of water, but also have a lot of annual weeds around them. And so newer ponds tend to be really good spots to go because you've got a lot of bare ground, exposed soil, and then we see a lot of those weeds growing in that exposed soil too. So you can kind of double up there.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you are wanting to hear their full conversation, you can find it by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net or by searching for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. You can also check out other things from the wildlife team by going to wildlife.k-state.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing renovating smooth brome grass with K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Extension Agronomist Tina Sullivan. Molly, Tina, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Today, as we're talking about smooth brome grass, we will just refer to it as brome. And while we're thinking about this right now in Kansas, how is it looking?
So overall, if we're kind of thinking about brome this year, it is a cool season, introduced species, and we have to kind of think back to how the spring was. It was warm and it was dry. Think about that, above average warm March and how dry it was. It did actually set back some of our brome just because that cool season grass does not like to be overly warm. And when it's stressed out, it will try to go to seed, so that seed head, quicker. So we saw a lot of brome stands earlier this year, not getting to the height we wanted. And if they were being cut for forage or baling, we just weren't getting as much biomass off of them. And then we're thinking about the heat we've had for July and August. Once again, if it doesn't like a warm spring, it definitely does not like a warm summer. So we are kind of going into the situation of some pretty dormant stands, even if we've received good rain in portions of the state that does grow our brome. It's just when it's too warm, it can't be as productive. And when it's not as productive, we may be seeing some of those stands thinning out due to fall armyworms over the past few seasons, or just not getting fertility it might need. There's a lot of other factors going into how well brome is going to pull out of the very warm season we've had.
If people are wanting to get brome back in their fields, is this the time of year to be getting all their ducks in a row to be able to do it?
This is the time of year to get our ducks in a row for planting our tame cool seasons. So smooth brome grass here. Also just briefly adding in tall fescue can also be planted this time of year. When we think about the state, yes, brome tends to be on the eastern side of the state, with the northern portion of the east falling into typically our fall planting range of August 15th through to September 15th. As we head south, we can extend out the end of our planting date to September 20th. And if we're in the deep southeast, to October 1st. And just thinking about the deep southeast, that's, from Butler County over towards the Missouri line and then, south to the Oklahoma line, we really only suggest fall planting for our cool seasons in that region.
Before they even go to plant, Molly, what are a few things you really encourage growers to consider doing?
I'd say for folks that are considering renovating their brome stand, or even if you're not and you're not getting the production in your current stand that you would hope to get, doing soil testing is always a good idea. So for renovating a new stand, doing things to correct, say, like your soil pH or address any fertility issues before you put in new seedings, you have a better chance for success. And if you are, say, like having lower production than you would hope, or say the stands has been more productive in that past and you haven't been getting as good a production as you would hope recently, it's a good sign to do a soil test. They're relatively cheap for the information they can give you, and it can help rule out other issues. So something good to consider is doing some soil testing before you make decisions of what you want to do with your stand going into the fall.
Is there a wide variety of seed choices for growers?
So when it comes to the varieties of smooth brome that are available, typically the seed tag is going to say VNS, or variety not stated. And it's just because there's not a whole lot of different genetic options when it comes to our smooth brome grass, or brome as we're talking about it here. Some seed dealers may have it listed as Lincoln, and it's just one of the historic varieties for the state of Kansas and the greater region, so Missouri into Nebraska. But we haven't done a whole lot of selective breeding to have a bunch of different varieties of smooth brome, unlike some of our other grasses.
What's the seeding rate that should be used?
If we are able to drill, so using a seed drill, we suggest 15 to 20 pounds live seed per acre. If we're going to broadcast it, we would suggest bumping that up probably to 20 to 25 pounds per acre, just because when we are broadcasting the seed, we might not be getting that best seed to soil contact and getting it planted at the correct depth.
Do you have any preferences or recommendations of drilling versus broadcasting?
When it comes to drilling versus broadcasting, it's kind of, depend if we're redoing an entire stand, or if we're just, rejuvenating a stand. You can see success in, no-till drilling into a current stand, but depending on the size of the area, if maybe it's just patchy, you may just want to just broadcast it by hand. So it's really depending on, are we trying to clean up those patches, or are we needing to redo large areas?
Tina, is there any special nurturing that someone could do to hopefully give their brome its best chance?
Like any kind of grass seed, we're going to want to plant it in its ideal window. Hopefully we've already done our fertility management to fix the soil, maybe nutrient deficiencies the soil's having, because we want to give those young seedling plants the best chance at survival as we can. And along with the fertility side, yes, we cannot control the weather, but if we're kind of seeing the 10-day forecast having no rain in sight, it's not the best to let those small grass seeds that are, yes, expensive at the end of the day, but they're going to lose viability the longer they're left out in the elements, especially in those broadcast situations. And just another key piece to remember when we're rejuvenating or reestablishing our stands, we have fall armyworms until we have frost. So just because, we haven't gotten a lot of reports yet doesn't mean we don't have still a long season that we could get those fall armyworms. And fall armyworms sure like to eat young emerging grasses, which has also been one of the, not cause and effect, but kind of push and pull of rejuvenating stands in the fall.
If growers don't want to rejuvenate their brome field this time of year, is there a different time that they could give it a try?
So with our cool seasons, if we're, the west has a lot more of a window, but we're really thinking about bromes in the east. As previously mentioned, the deep southeast, we're not going to recommend a spring planting. But if we're kind of more towards central or the northeast, we do have a window of February 15th to March 15th. So we do have that other option, but we kind of run into some other, issues there. Is it the rain? Is it, rain availability? But we're also kind of competing with weeds at that time of the year too. So it's a catch-22 of what kind of issues do we want to deal with when we're trying to reestablish our brome.
Molly, we made a mention of soil testing. Is there anything else that growers should be doing with their soil to get it ready?
Yeah, one of the best things you can do in addition to doing soil testing is to prep your seedbed. So if you can do some light tillage to help break things up and bring stuff up, that could be weeds that can otherwise give a flush where you can apply some non-selective herbicide, basically glyphosate, while you're prepping that seedbed before you do seeding. That's always a good idea, and we're kind of in that window now. Usually don't really recommend past August to do that, but you can just do applications without tillage to kill the current stand if you're going to completely renovate the stand before you plant seed in the fall.
In the process of getting that seed bed ready, is there a weed suppression aspect that should be taken into consideration?
Yes. So weed pressure can make it hard for smooth brome to establish, especially early on. So right before you're planning to seed in, it'd be good to do some weed control if you already have issues in your weed field. If you're completely prepping the bed, like do your total stand renovation, typically we would recommend that you would do a non-selective herbicide application, glyphosate more or less, to kill anything that's coming up, including stand that you're trying to kill out and any weeds that could give a lot of pressure onto our new seedlings that we're trying to put in the ground. If we're talking about seeding into the early part of next year, depending on where you are in the state, the other thing that you want to consider too is annual bromes, which tend to be kind of problematic as we're going into the fall. We covered that I think in an e-update back in June or July. That has a list of a lot of different herbicides or a few different herbicides you can use. One thing to keep in mind with those is that usually doing herbicides early before they're germinating is the best way to control those. So more or less keeping in mind how you're going to control weed pressure when you're kind of in this transition period is good to think about ahead of time when you're thinking about renovating your stand.
Molly, Tina, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Extension Agronomist Tina Sullivan. If you would like to read more on this topic, you can do so by checking out a recent agronomy e-update titled Planting Cool Season Perennials, Smooth Brome Grass. It will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it for yourself by going to agronomy.k-state.edu/e-updates. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk with this week's Milk Lines.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. Summer may be winding down, but heat stress remains a concern for dairy herds. K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk says THI, the combination of temperature and humidity, can have a huge impact on cows milking more than 77 pounds of milk per day. And that making water available as cows exit the parlor is one way to reduce losses.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some issues with heat stress in our dairy herds. As I think about the end of summer and the fact that we're still under some fairly significant heat stress, there's a few things I wanted to remind our producers. Number one, when the THI, the combination of temperature and humidity, rises above 65, those animals producing more than 77 pounds of milk per day begin experiencing the negative effects of heat stress. So, what percent of your herd today is milking more than 77 pounds per day? My guess is for most of our herds across the state, has a very, very significant portion of our total cows in the milking herd. Now, the thing that does not take into consideration is you probably have a fair number of animals that are early lactation that are producing under 77 pounds per day. Those are the ones that are actually greatly impacted by heat stress because as they experience heat stress, they will produce lower peak milk production and have lower milk production throughout their entire lactation. So maybe just looking at it from the number of animals that are producing less than 77 pounds in your herd may not really show the total effect of heat stress on your herd. Also, as we look at heat stress and modern dairy cows, the threshold for where we see significant losses is about 68 on the THI scale. THI is above 72. Milk production generally drops by about 0.86 pounds for every THI unit above 72. So you think about some of the heat we've had the last few weeks, and you think about where your current level of milk production is in your herd, it might actually apply to your herd. And the fact that you have lost quite a bit of milk production, and it is due to the fact that animals are just heat stressed and we're not taking enough effort to reduce that heat stress among those animals. I was reminded this week that there's a very simple thing that we can do to help her cope with heat stress, and that has to do with the availability of drinking water on the parlor exit. You know, as I think back 25 years ago, some of us here at K-State actually measured the amount of water that cattle consumed as they exited the milking parlor. We found that on average, about 3.5 gallons of consumption of water per cow per day when they were provided adequate water space on the parlor exit. That's about 10% of their total daily intake. It's very important that we provide water on those milking parlor exit lanes. And you can do that anywhere along the fence, and it can just be for the summertime. Ideally, it would be nice if you could keep those waters open during the winter, but if we can't, what can you do along those fence lines as those cows exit the milking parlor to provide them with some drinking water? Take a look at your operation, what you're currently doing. You need to probably have about 2 foot of linear water space for every cow that's going to be exiting in a group. So if you have a double 10 parlor, that means you need about 20 linear feet. 2 times 10 cows, because the cows will exit the milking parlor in general in groups of 10. So it's not a great distance that you actually have to take into account as you try to apply this principle. And a simple garden hose with a simple float on a water that just simply hangs on the fence would be adequate to provide those animals with adequate water space. One other final thought on this is those waters need to refill very quickly because there's another group coming behind the group that's currently there drinking. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to carefully evaluate how they might be able to provide adequate water on the milking parlor exit lane.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.